My next guest uses his voice as an instrument as a spoken word artist. He's also an author, vocalist, and instructor. He's performed his poems all over the Southeast, and his poems have appeared in several publications like Drum Voice, Out of the Rough, African American Review, and Poets. Mr. Felton Eden, thank you so much for being with us today on In Contact. How are you?
I'm doing well, thanks. How are you?
I'm doing fantastic. So tell me, what sparked your love for poetry?
I had a very interesting English teacher at a very early age in my life, but prior to that, I fell in love with a girl in my class. And, you know, just like the puppy love kind of thing, and I was very shy as a boy and actually wrote poems to her and hid them in the bookshelf until my sisters found them, and so they outed me as a poet then. And so I've been in love with poetry ever since. I hid my poems for a very long time, not letting anyone see any of them, because it was my deep emotions, and it was a way to get over some emotional trauma that I felt within.
So is poetry therapeutic as well? You kind of just led into that just a little bit.
It's extremely therapeutic. There are lots of people who write it. I mean, from housewives to children to all kinds of people write poems, and they're also inspired by poems. And it's been that way since the beginning of time. So that we have a fusion that has occurred too that merges poetry with other arts disciplines, and some of that is like really, really very hot now.
And so poetry, we would consider that part of the fine arts. Can you talk to our audience and tell us a little bit about how long you have been writing and performing poetry?
Well, I started, as I said, I started writing poetry as a child, and my talent was really further discovered when I was a student when I was an undergraduate student. I had a professor who had a class in literature, and we were writing as English majors. Of course, we were studying great writers all the time, but then a few of us were writing, and so we inspired each other to write. And I continued to study and decided to go to graduate school in creative writing, and I studied for a master's degree in creative writing with a specialty in poetry, and started working as a poet in residence after that, which was a job that I'd never heard of before. So it's just sort of stumbled along and ended up working as a poet in residence, and moved from there to work in arts education. So I had a career here in Atlanta for a number of years as an arts education specialist, working with the State Arts Council and then the County Arts Council, Fulton County Arts Council, which is one of the biggest in the Southeast, and it provides a great level of funding for a variety of arts disciplines and for individuals and also companies.
Well, we can't have you on the show without hearing a little bit of your poetry. I hear there's Skeeter Beach. Is that a poem that you maybe be able to recite a few stanzas?
Yes, Skeeter Beach is a poem that I wrote about a beach in Charleston, and a little of it goes like this. There are no maps, no highway signs that lead to Skeeter Beach, but the people know the way there. There to the open-faced joints where horns and guitars blast songs, speak of seduction, compete for the first dance, others for the last chance.
Wow. So what is that you're playing?
This instrument is called a kalimba, and it's from West Africa. Its cousin is the mbira from South Africa, which is a larger and a wider instrument, and it's also referred to as a thumb piano sometimes.
Wow. Thank you for sharing that, that instrument and part of your poem.
You're quite welcome.
So April is National Poets Month. Can you talk to us a little bit about the appreciation of poetry and how we can continue to drive that as we move forward throughout generations?
Well, I think that it's important for different arts entities to start including poetry at a higher rate than they are. But there are a wide range of poets, just as there are musicians. There are poets who consider themselves spoken word poets, and that's all they do is something that's verbal and something dramatic. And then there are other poets who write their work, and then there is a fusion back and forth between the two. But I think that the more we try to program poetry, the better it is. And the Hammonds House Museum is a place that has begun to program poetry recently, which is somewhat unprecedented for a museum of its size. But it brings in a number of poets through an organization that I work with, Felton Edie's Poetry Kitchen. And we're there often at the end of the month.
Okay.
And so it's exposing a lot of people to the discipline. And then, of course, there are spoken word events all over the city, practically any night of the week if you wish to hear poetry.
So there was a movie that came out over 10 years ago called Love Jones. And in that movie, there was a lot of spoken word, and it really kind of brought awareness to poetry and open mic night. Can you talk about the importance of that type of creative expression?
I wish that something like that would happen again, because I think it was a real boon for the arts discipline to be able to enjoy that and to take it to a much broader audience. Deaf Poetry Jam has also been instrumental in bringing a lot of poets to the front. But it's something that concerns me in that we have libraries, for example, that don't readily support poetry. A lot of them are actually doing more programming in visual arts. They have gallery spaces and are promoting the visual arts. When there are a wealth of poets that are around the city, for example, here in Atlanta, I probably know 25 poets easily without even thinking about it, pretty much. But it needs to be mainstream more and need to be brought to the to children and to schools. And arts education programs, we're doing that, but the funding for arts education programs has decreased significantly.
So how can our audience, one, increase the awareness, but also support programming like you're talking about?
Well, I think that people need to keep in mind the simplicity of poetry and how one doesn't have to have fancy equipment or supplies in order to write it. It can be written just on the phone or on a plain piece of paper. It can be written. And it's very easy to go into the space that's necessary to write poems, but you got to do it.
So you have been a professor at a local HBCU. Can you talk about your experience there?
Well, I taught world literature composition and I taught the poetry course. And it was very exciting because the poetry course increased in number. There were a small number of students in the poetry course when I first started teaching it as an adjunct professor there. But fast forward about 10 years and the numbers increased tremendously, partly because of the influence of the broader culture, because of the influence of rap music and hip hop music, all of that expanded the purview of poetry. And so the classes were very exciting. Our students produced a portfolio. We also were involved in poetry slams, which is an amazing competition that seems to go on from city to city. And we did slams there for 9 years. And they were well attended and well performed. Some of the performers were really excellent there.
So how can we prepare students and really drive home the importance of arts as students matriculate through education? How can we really reinforce the importance of fine arts and poetry?
Well, there has to be space. One has to create space, and with STEAM programs sort of catching fire as they are, it's hard to create a space for poetry, but that has to first happen. There has to be a space for it so that it's respected. And that comes from multiple areas. That is, the poets themselves have to respect themselves, and they also have to demand to be respected. It doesn't come just, voila. It's not something instant. I think that it's also very accessible in that one can get a book of poems and read that in a very short period of time rather than having to read a novel. Certainly, there are many, many different elements in a poem than there are in a piece of fiction. And then politicians have to be convinced that it's necessary and that it's important. If they aren't convinced that it's necessary and important, then they're not going to fund it. They're not going to create structures that will allow funding for it. But it's, it goes both ways. That is, poets have to also inform politicians that poetry is valuable and it's necessary, it's accessible, and little old ladies write it and children write it.
Absolutely. So tell me, what is next for you? Do you have any upcoming events?
I do. As I said, the Hammonds House supports Felton Edie's Poetry Kitchen, and we bring on a half dozen or so poets each time for the evening for entertainment of the general population. And we have fairly small audiences, probably 30 or 40 people at the most there. But that's an intimate enough audience for people to have a real experience with the poets, and then to also engage in writing a poem as a group at the very end of the process.
So they can take that away with them as a piece of art.
They can, or they can relish in the line that they created for the poem.
Wow.
So it gets to be very powerful sometimes, and quite emotional it can be. As you know, poetry draws on all emotions.
So how can our audience get in contact with you and learn more about the programs that you're involved in, as well as the books of poetry that you've been published in and your own poetry?
Felton Edie, or Felton Edie's Poetry Kitchen on Facebook is an excellent way to keep up with what we're doing, and it's also an excellent way for other poets to contact me about presenting their work there, or about buying my books or buying my materials, and also for promoting their own materials. And a lot of that needs to be done. Cross-pollination needs to happen in order for the art to be advanced.
Mr. Edie, thank you for joining me today on The Couch.
It's been wonderful. Thank you for having me.
You're so welcome.